So I'm delighted to be here with the Episcopal Church in Vermont, and I am grateful to you, Bishop Tom, for inviting me, and for the ministry support team, Lynn and Julie and Donna, Susan, Michelle, Elizabeth, and Kathleen, and also, of course, the Dean of your great cathedral, Jean, for making it possible and putting on such a great convention. Now, here's what happened to me when I agreed to come and speak to you this weekend. I first agreed to give a keynote. That's this. And then I agreed to give a workshop. And then a dinner address. And preach at your convention Eucharist. And then preach again on Sunday here at the cathedral. And then I realized that all of the things that I agreed to do, your bishop is very persuasive, meant that there's an excellent chance that you will get sick of me. Especially the delegates from the cathedral. So this afternoon I'm going to talk, but I'm also going to ask to hear from all of you in a couple of different ways. And rest assured, I believe in very short dinner speeches. So it's been fun. I've been having fun with this theme of this convention, jazzed about God's mission. And I thought about a flapper dress, but I wisely decided against it. And then I discovered there's something called a potato jazz microwave kit. My husband actually goes to Mark's. This is a wholesale place we have in Ohio. And he comes home with, it's like the stuff he brings home from the church rummage sale. And he brought home something called the potato jazz microwave kit. And it sounds terrible, and actually it is. It's terrible. Even if it does come in zesty Italian flavor. But jazz, as it turns out, is a great way to think about the kind of change that we need to be undertaking in the Episcopal Church, and more on that shortly. First, let's talk about the mission part of the theme, God's mission. That's easy. We can all agree that the Church should do whatever it can to participate in God's mission, except, how do we know what God's mission is? We used to be fairly certain as Episcopalians that we knew all about God's mission. Some of us even thought that we were in charge of explaining it to other people. But it turns out that as a church, we need to do some remedial discernment work. We need to think again about God's mission for the Episcopal Church in our time. We know something about what it isn't. It's not the model of a church building with a full-time priest that many of us knew when we were growing up. According to Dr. Matthew Price, who is the Vice President of Research and Data for the Church Pension Fund, and these are, listen carefully, these are startling statistics. 32% of the congregations who had at least one priest in 2006 had experienced a decline in the number of clergy on staff by 2013. And of congregations that had one priest in 2006, 30% of those had no clergy on staff in 2013. 30%. So if that old model, a dedicated building with a full-time priest, is required for us to do God's mission, we're in deep trouble. And we also need to let go of the idea that we need a lot of money to participate in God's mission. Between 2006 and 2013, congregations experienced a 7% decline in operating revenue, an 8% decline in pledge income, and an 11% decline in pledge cards. There was no decline in clergy compensation amounts. So that means a higher proportion of the church's resources are being used to pay for clergy now than in the past. And it's clear, we know that's not sustainable. But you didn't need me to come all the way from Ohio to tell you that, because here in the Episcopal Church in Vermont, you are already facing this new reality of the Episcopal Church, and you know that God's mission for us is changing. One of my favorite poets, I quoted him this morning, an Irish poet and priest, John O'Donoghue, wrote about the change we are now facing. He wrote, "To change is one of the great dreams of every heart. To change the limitations, the sameness, the banality, or the pain. So often we look back on patterns of behavior, the kind of decisions we make repeatedly and that have failed to serve us well, and we aim for a new and more successful path or way of living. But change is difficult for us," he writes. "So often we opt to continue the old pattern rather than risking the danger of difference. We are also surprised by change that seems to arrive out of nowhere. We find ourselves crossing some new threshold we never anticipated. Like a spring secretly at work within the heart of winter, below the surface of our lives, huge changes are in fermentation. We never suspect a thing. Then when the grip of some long-enduring winter mentality begins to loosen, we find ourselves vulnerable to a flourish of possibility, and we are suddenly negotiating the challenge of a threshold. We find ourselves vulnerable to a flourish of possibility, and we are suddenly negotiating the challenge of a threshold." Now that sounds to me like a description of how we discover God's mission. By any measure, demographic, financial, spiritual, liturgical, the Episcopal Church is negotiating a challenge of a threshold right now. And there are at least two ways, there's probably more, but there are at least two ways to think about this kind of change. We can think about it as people who are custodians of a once grand institution that is charged with maintaining those grand buildings, that prayer book, that cultural and social status. And if we think about crossing the threshold as guardians of the institution of the church, pretty much everything looks like loss and decline. It's depressing. It's depressing to think about church like that. You think about loss and decline all the time, and I don't recommend it. And it really doesn't seem to be a fruitful path to discerning God's mission. So let's think about it differently. We can also think about change, about standing on the threshold as people who are secure in our identity as the children of God in the Episcopal Church. The world might swirl around us, but we know who we are, and we can stretch our identity to accommodate the changes we need to make. My friend and colleague, Dr. Matthew Sheep, I worked with him for almost 10 years at Credo Institute, a wellness program of the pension fund. He's a business professor at Illinois State University, and he thinks that this ability to stretch our identity is the great strength of the Episcopal Church. For the past decade, he and two other researchers have been studying the Episcopal Church's identity. And they started their study in 2004, the year after our friend Gene Robinson was ordained and elected an ordained bishop next door in New Hampshire. They've had their work accepted for publication in the Academy of Management Journal, which is just as impressive as it sounds. And the title of the study, I just love the titles these people come up with. Elasticity and the Dialectic Tensions of Organizational Identity. But I love the second part after the colon. How can we hold together while we're pulling apart? Basically, Matthew and his colleagues, Elaine and Glenn, found that we Episcopalians are pretty elastic. And what exactly does that mean? In a recent interview with the news department at Illinois State University, Matthew explained it this way. People might be constructing identity when an expansion is going on, like for a merger or an acquisition, or when there is a strategic change. So when you do that, there are members and leaders in your organization who will say, great, welcome, come in, it's a big tent, let's include everybody, let's include all of these identities. Our identity is elastic enough to accommodate this. He goes on and says, there are others who will say, that's not who we've always been. That isn't true to our roots. It isn't true to who we've been in the past. So they are constructing identity in a more inelastic way. I know there's no such word as inelastic, but I'm quite sure any of you who have ever been to vestry meetings are familiar with these two schools of thought. What was it somebody said that the seven last words aren't, we've never done it like that before? So, but I'm a big fan of the first school of thought. The one where we say, great, welcome, come on in, it's a big tent. Let's include everyone. I'm a fan of this approach to Episcopal identity, not just because Matthew studied it for 10 years, but it's also how I believe Jesus said we're supposed to do it. God knows who we are as the people of God in the Episcopal Church, and God knows it's not about buildings or full-time clergy or social status or endowments. And because God knows these things, God has a new mission for us.
Thank you.
Just like John O'Donohue says, like spring secretly at work within the heart of winter, below the surface of our lives, huge changes are in fermentation. So, what kind of huge changes are fermenting out there? Here's some of what I see. Across the church, I see people finding new ways to use the rituals and traditions of Anglicanism in public liturgy. Clergy and lay people are inventing new ways of taking liturgy into the world through such events or commemorations like Ashes to Go. I think you do that in this diocese, Ashes to Go. Stations of the Cross that mark places where gun violence has happened, like blessing of the animals at Humane Society shelters. Our identity is elastic to know that we can make the ancient rituals of the church speak to the world we live in today. Alternate Deputy Emily Malott from Chicago said it this way: I think we impoverish ourselves if we limit our symbols and sacraments to just what's possible in the walls of the church. We learn things by taking liturgy outside the walls that teach us new ways of seeing God inside the walls. That's elastic identity. There's a burgeoning movement that is forming Episcopal worshiping communities in very unlikely places like laundromats. In Santa Monica, California, there's a worshiping community called Tom's that started in an empty restaurant, and they use its money to pay for a ministry called Laundry Love, a ministry in laundromats that does the laundry of people who don't have enough money to do it on their own. Now Laundry Love has become a national movement. And it started, according to its website, when a homeless man by the name of T-Bone was asked, T-Bone, how can we come alongside your life in a way that would matter? His response, if I had clean clothes, I think people would treat me like a human being. That's how it started, just by that one need. So when I hear about this kind of new energy, I think we're getting more comfortable with our elastic identity, and we're getting closer to figuring out God's mission for us today. Here's another kind of new energy that I think is bringing us closer to God's mission. I'm seeing some Episcopalians work harder to speak about the issues facing our country and our culture in Christian terms. Now, back in the days of full church buildings and overflowing coffers and overcrowded Sunday school rooms, and let's just say we might be remembering those days, if they ever really existed, just a bit of nostalgia. But back in those days, we assumed that what the Episcopal Church thought about social issues was what the ruling class thought, and vice versa. Back in those days, a larger percentage of congressmen, and they were nearly always men, were Episcopalians, and so were lots of judges and corporate leaders and a fair number of presidents, 11 to be exact. But things have changed. The Episcopal Church does not represent the ruling class. We do not represent the majority. We do not have special access to the quarters of power. We are no longer the establishment church. And actually, I thank God for that. Because I think that these demographic and societal shifts mean that we have more obligation than ever before to advocate, because our Christian viewpoints about peace and justice are countercultural. And many Episcopalians, including Bishop Tom, and many of you here in Vermont, are doing just that. And when we advocate for peace and justice and the dignity of every human being, we are often advocating against the forces of empire, not in collusion with them. That's a huge change. That's a huge change. We couldn't have even imagined the Episcopal Church like that 30, 40, 50 years ago. That's elastic identity at work. Some folks argue with Episcopalians doing advocacy, saying that no one cares what the Episcopal Church thinks anymore. But I say, in the words of our new presiding Bishop Michael Curry, God is not through with the Episcopal Church yet. So how about you? Where do you see signs of change? Where do you see signs that we're moving closer to God's mission for the Episcopal Church? And what threshold, what would you like? My mother was a lifelong Episcopalian, and she had some great sayings. One of them was that the only problem with the church is that it's riddled with human beings. But my favorite saying that she had was, the only people who like change are wet babies. But here we are, Episcopalians, standing on the threshold, trying to discern God's mission for us today. And at this point, we've all figured out that it probably involves change, right? And we're going to have to change old patterns and risk the dangers of difference. And that's where jazz comes in, finally, right? About 15 years ago, PBS produced a documentary called The Devil's Music, 1920s Jazz. And listen to the way the program's website describes the development of jazz. When the new sound of jazz first spread across America in the early 20th century, it left delight and controversy in its wake. The more popular it became, The more the liberating and sensuous music was criticized by everyone and everything, from car maker Henry Ford to publications like the Ladies' Home Journal and the New York Times. Yet, jazz survived. Jazz was different because it broke the rules, musical and social. It featured improvisation over traditional structure, performer over composer, and Black American experience over conventional white sensibilities. Undercurrents of racism bore strongly upon the opposition to jazz, which was seen as barbaric and immoral. Before jazz emerged, many music educators, worried that jazz would destroy young people's interest in classical music, tried to convince the public that European classical music was the only good music. The website continues, "One day I was in a practice room, supposedly practicing classical music, but I was playing some jazz, and I guess my professor heard me because he opened the door and looked in and said, 'Stop playing that trash,'" remembers jazz musician Marion McPartland. But the music played on. Now, in the spirit of jazz, let's improvise with that history a little bit. When the new Episcopal Church first spread across America in the early 21st century, it left delight and controversy in its wake. The more popular it became, the more this liberated church was criticized by everyone and everything, from evangelist Franklin Graham to publications like the New York Times and Fox News. Yet, the Episcopal Church survived. This new Episcopal Church was different because it broke the rules: cultural, liturgical, musical, social. It featured improvisation over traditional structure, grassroots networks over hierarchy, and Black American experience over conventional white sensibilities. Undercurrents of racism bore strongly upon the opposition to the Episcopal Church's changes in liturgy, music, and outreach, which were seen as barbaric and immoral. Before the new Episcopal Church emerged, many clergy and even some bishops worried that the new spirit of the church would destroy young people's interest in traditional liturgy and church structures, tried to convince the public that traditional Anglican forms were the only good church. One day, I was in a practice room, supposedly practicing traditional church music, but I was playing some jazz, and I guess my professor heard me because he opened the door and looked in and said, "Stop playing that trash." But the Episcopal Church played on. So if we're really going to get jazzed about God's mission, we're going to have to break some rules. We're going to have to make some people uncomfortable and maybe even unhappy. And we're going to have to learn to live with people hearing that we're destroying the Anglican tradition, our Episcopal heritage, or the Christian family, or one thing or another. We're going to have to improvise, and we're going to have to try new things that will sometimes, maybe even often, fail at first. I don't know about you, but all of this talk of change and breaking rules and trying new things actually gets me excited. And what I've just heard from some of the things that you are thinking up and dreaming and doing, I get even more excited. The change that's happening is bigger than my term in office, and it's going to take longer than the active ministry I have left. And that's probably true for most of you as well. But this sort of thing happens to the children of God. We know from Scripture that God's mission has a very long life. And God's mission is much longer than our lives, our buildings, or our bishop's lives, or even our church's life. David didn't get to build the temple. Moses didn't get to enter the promised land, and we're not going to know the rest of the story for the Episcopal Church. So maybe the hardest change we have to make is to be able to trust that God's mission is longer than we know, trust those who come after us, trust that God is working not just in us, but in the young people we see who don't do things the right way, or don't follow the rules, or don't see things the same way. God is working in and through them as well. Maybe God is especially working in and through them. So today, in the 21st century, when people don't go to church and don't believe in organized religion much, and don't really trust institutions, we're a remnant people. And we are God's remnant people searching for God's mission for us. And here's what the prophet Zephaniah said about remnant people, because I don't want you to worry about being remnant people. It's not bad. It's really not all that bad. Zephaniah wrote, "The remnant of Israel shall do no unrighteousness, and speak no lies, nor shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth. For they shall feed their flocks and lie down, and no one shall make them afraid." So let's cross this threshold without being afraid. Let's not just wonder what God's mission is for us, but let's go out like many of you here are doing and seek it with elastic identities and grateful hearts. So we've got about, 10, 15, 20 minutes left. So I would be happy to answer any question. First of all, I'd love to hear any comments about anything I've said or something you might disagree with, or any questions you might have about that great party in Salt Lake City, the General Convention, and what we did there, or about this triennium in the Episcopal Church, or anything else that is. Thank you so much. This was really enjoyable. Thank you so much.